From the sidelines, Nyla's life seemed perfect. She married Levon, a consistent man, employed as a digital archivist in a large modern library. Although their marriage had ups and downs, as years went by, they discovered a rhythm of domesticity, the humdrum of daily life setting into a comfortable, if not always passionate, routine. Not least of all Nyla herself. None could have imagined the sinister secrets rotting under the surface. But secrets, as they sometimes do, find their way to surface. When her marriage felt like a forgotten relic, Nyla met Ari, a young man of great confidence and beauty, usually leaving Nyla alone in their large house, more often than not. Levon was always engrossed in his work, reading over rare manuscripts and old relics. Ari was unique, a free spirit employed as a photographer for a famous gallery whose creative energy set something long dormant inside her ablaze. What started out as friendly flirtation soon descended into something far more intense. Ari, then 19, was almost 10 years her junior, but it seemed to make no difference when they were together. Nyla sank into the passion she had long missed. Friends, sorry to interrupt, but please help me reach 2,000 subscribers by the end of the summer. Let's keep going. Their affair went months under layers of lies and invented tales. Although Ari knew she was married, Nyla told him her relationship with Levon was more of a formality. She assured him of a future, a life together away from her uneventful marriage. She was cautious, until one evening, quite fatal. Nyla had started to become paranoid. Levon had been behaving aloof lately, and she worried he might have suspicions. Her intuition came rather close to reality. Levon was supposedly at the library one evening, and Nyla decided to check his phone. She then noticed a sequence of dubious texts from an unknown number. Messages loaded with cryptic exchanges concerning Ari. Her heart dropped. Nyla's paranoia deepened over the next several days. She was unable to shake a gnawing sensation. She watched Levon's behavior closely and noted that it was growing more and more erratic. He would avoid her more than usual and leave his house for extended periods, only to return with an odd glimmer in his eyes. There seemed to be something wrong. She started to put things together and, fearing what she could discover, took Levon's phone once more while he slept. She dug out the terrible reality. For weeks, Levon had been surreptitiously monitoring her. GPS data showed he had followed her to the locations she visited, meticulously noting their movements. But it was worse still than that. Levon had dug quite deeply. Too deeply. She came upon a note meant to ruin everything. Unbelievably, Levon had found Ari was his cousin, split across years and distances, but still family. Nyla, incredulous, struggled to understand the twisted web of fate she had caught herself in. The matter spun out of hand. Levon faced her with everything he knew the following morning. His face wore a mask of icy anger. Though he hardly spoke, the anger in his eyes spoke to her everything. He had been waiting, observing, gathering proof for weeks, and had known. I trusted you, Nyla, he said in a venomous whisper, but you have been lying to yourself, as well as to me, for so long. Nyla was on a breaking point, and something inside her snapped as the confrontation got more intense. The idea of Ari being Levon's blood relative drove her over the line. She could not stand to look at Levon's cold, calculated face anymore. The very fact of their affair now seemed horrible. It happened one evening, a few days following Levon's discovery. Nyla and Ari had met in the remote area, where they usually sought solace from the world, a cabin Ari used for his photographic endeavors. Ari sensed Nyla's conflict. She was overwhelmed with guilt and desperation. She told him everything, including the knowledge that Levon knew, the twisted irony of Ari being his cousin. Still the optimist, Ari reassured her they could still find a way out, and they could still be together. Nyla had already formed her opinion, though. 2 days later, following a tip regarding Ari's unexpected disappearance, the police arrived at the cabin and discovered she dead. His body was cold, crumpled on the ground, with a terrible head blow. Nyla had left the scene quickly, but not without leaving any trace. The inquiry proceeded quickly. Ground-penetrating radar was used by authorities to survey the area in search of any evidence of possible burial sites or foul behavior. Everything leading up the incident was captured on Ari's camera, including their argument, the intense emotions, and, at last, the sound of Nyla striking him in a blind wrath. Days later, Nyla was taken into custody. The data was damning. Ari's blood on her clothes, the video footage, even Levon's story of the affair. The inquiry turned up far more than anybody had anticipated. Although detectives had pieced together the complex network of her infidelity, even the most experienced detectives were startled by the terrible twist of Ari being Levon's cousin. Nyla could not get away from the stifling awareness of what she had done as she sat in her cell waiting for the next stage of her life. Originally a means of escape from her failing marriage, the affair turned tragic, an irrevocable error that destroyed not only her life, but two families linked by a bloodline she never knew existed. The little close-knit community was rocked by Nyla's arrest. As soon as word of the murder got out, everyone could not overlook the two graphic details. Married to one man, a woman caught in a passionate affair with another, who proved to be the cousin of her own husband, people murmured softly, spun tales out of every tiny detail, bent the truth into something even darker. From an unidentified person, Nyla had evolved into the center of a dramatic tragedy. Days after her arrest, the inquiry got more intense. Driven to find out why Ari died, investigators dug into every facet of Nyla's life. They started by rebuilding the last days before the murder. Now, a regular feature of the research, Levon gave vital information. Through Ari's social media, he had found the affair. He noticed how this younger man would casually bring up visits with an unidentified woman. Levon first considered it a coincidence, but something about Ari's cryptic messages made him uncomfortable. Deeper, he found more sites that matched Nyla's past. Though Levon was rigorous, it was subtle. His suspicions were validated when he came upon a blurry picture of Nyla's silhouette on Ari's private account, clear enough for someone who knew her so intimately. Though Levon's discovery was terrible, the knowledge that Ari was his cousin tormented him most. His family was big, and he hadn't kept in touch with many cousins given distance and time. Levon verified the truth, though, by delving deeply into old family records and speaking with his estranged relatives. Ari, the young man Nyla had been seeing, shared his blood. Levon's heartbreak became rage, but he avoided facing Nyla right away. Instead, driven to find out exactly how far the betrayal had gone, he meticulously followed their movements. Levon followed them once more to Ari's remote cabin the evening the murder took place. From a distance, he watched the two fight. Although he couldn't hear their words, Nyla's hands shook as she pushed Ari away. Levon had no idea what would follow. Levon could only shake his head, lost in the memory of his own inaction, when researchers asked him why he had not intervened. Maybe he had hoped Nyla would sense it. She was going to leave Ari. Rather, events unfolded in a way none of us could have predicted. Nyla's mental state started to take front stage during the research. Her defense team noted right away that she had been under extreme stress. Her once solid life had collapsed into anarchy when she discovered the man she thought she loved was bound to her in ways incomprehensible. Her actions reflected her guilt, fear of her husband learning, and shock of Ari's family ties. Her defense contended that it was an act of desperation in a flash of craziness, not planned. But the prosecution told a different tale. They painstakingly showed the chronology of events, depicting Nyla as a cold-blooded woman who had decided to kill her lover instead of facing the fallout from her treachery. Apart from the fatal blow to the head, the ground-penetrating radar used to search the area gave horrifying details about the scene. Ari's body showed no signs of struggle. Still blebs from his blood, the murder weapon, a heavy metal lamp, was discovered in the cabin. Clearly to the prosecution, Nyla had snapped, but it was not out of panic. Ari was a loose thread, someone who knew too much and might have exposed her to Levon and the world. Thus, she had killed him. More unsettling aspects of Ari's life that added to the enigmas. The researchers also found Nyla had always loved his photos, but in the months before his death, they darkened. Ari's camera captured hundreds of pictures, Some artistic, but many were honest views of Nyla taken without her knowledge. These pictures covered months, catching private events, fights, and stolen kisses. It suggested a perhaps poisonous relationship between the two by depicting a young man consumed and obsessed by his affair with Nyla. Nyla's defense said that Aries' threat to tell Levon about the affair set off the last argument. She had screamed out in terror in her shock. The prosecution responded with proof of Nyla's exacting planning, deleted messages on her phone, suppressed memories of other lovers, and her choice to meet Aries in secret, even after learning he was Levon's cousin. She had chosen consciously to them, and that decision led to Aries' death. The forensic evidence was indisputable, but during the inquiry, another turn of events developed. Interviewing Levon's relatives, the detectives found secrets that gave the narrative still another level. For years, Levon's family engaged in legal conflicts over property. Aries' branch of the family had been at odds with Levon's for generations. Levon personally participated little in the conflict, but his estranged relationship with Aries' side of the family suggested deeper, unresolved tensions. Some said Ari had known about this family conflict and had sought Nyla specifically to set off Levon. Those close to Ari, on the other hand, disagreed, characterizing him as a laid-back person looking just for passion and inspiration. Nyla stayed in custody while the inquiry got underway, her future unknown. She was no more the confident woman who had enthralled Aries with her appeal as the trial day drew near. Her past had caught up with her, and now she had to pay for her actions whole. Once a secret affair between two covert lovers, her story was about to be revealed in court for public view. As the trial started, the courtroom hummed with expectation, and scandalous weight permeated the space. A shell of the woman she once was, Nyla stood in the defendant's chair, with her once bright eyes now dull and clouded with regret. Sitting among the audience, Levon watched her closely. His face was blank, but his heart was bursting with conflicting emotions. He had not spoken to her since the arrest, and now he sat among strangers, compelled to see the breakdown of the life they had shared. The prosecution wasted no time creating a negative picture of Nyla. They detailed every lie she had told to hide her affair, every secret meeting, and every betrayal. Talia Manoukian, the prosecutor, was unrelenting, and her voice was like a sharp knife as she detailed the circumstances before Aries died. She presented Nyla as a lust-driven woman, ready to compromise not only her husband, but also the moral foundation of her own life. Manoukian grabbed at Nyla's admission that she knew of Ari's relationship to Levon prior to the murder, contending that this information drove her to carry out the ultimate crime. Manoukian told the jury her affair was a calculated betrayal of the worst kind, not only infidelity. With one permanent act of violence, Nyla destroyed two families rather than only violating her marriage vows. And she silenced the one person who knew too much when she realized the degree of her betrayal instead of facing the consequences. The courtroom was shown the evidence the inquiry had turned up over the trial. For the jury, Aries' pictures of Nyla, many of which she knew nothing about, were displayed. These pictures made it abundantly evident that Ari had been enamored with her, maybe more than Nyla had known. He had recorded almost every moment they shared, including vulnerable times. Once personal and lovely to Nyla, the pictures now seemed invasive and eerie, casting Ari in a different light. Under attorney Rafi Al-Masri, the defense sought to show Nyla in a more sympathetic light. Although they disagreed about whether Nyla had killed Ari, they said it was more of a crime of passion than premeditated murder. They drew attention to her worsening mental state prior to the incident, pointing out the extreme guilt and stress she felt upon finding out Ari had a relationship to Levon. Nyla was imprisoned in a dream she created, Al-Masri said. Her mind could not understand the enormity of her activities when she realized the truth. She screamed in that moment of panic, terror, and guilt, not as a killer, but rather as a woman pushed to the brink by uncontrollably acting forces. Al-Masri also called witnesses attesting to Nyla's precarious mental state during the weeks preceding the murder. Friends and relatives told of her growing distance, paranoia, and emotional volatility. Lale, Nyla's sister, sobbed as she related how Nyla had called her the day before the murder, speaking in a frantic tone, worried that Levon was watching her. Lala said, her voice shaking. She was terrified. She insisted that her life was falling apart, and that Levon knew everything. She was not her own self. Her voice let me hear it. Levon himself, though, had the most eerie testimony. Called to the stand, he related how he had found the affair, and in the course of doing so, the terrible family link. His cool head turned the court off balance. He spoke with a cold detachment that stopped everyone, not with anger. I loved my wife, Levin said, his voice hollow but steady. Still, love does not cover what she did. She murdered Ari and turned on me. That is not changed by his being my cousin. What counts is, she destroyed everything, instead of coming clean, since she couldn't face the truth. Levon stopped before responding when asked whether he believed Nyla had behaved out of hate. I believe she was quite desperate, he said gently. But desperation does not clear guilt. Presenting forensic evidence marked the turning point in the trial. The courtroom watched Ari's camera footage, a sobering reminder of the last minutes before his death. The audio caught Nyla and Ari's growing argument, their voices getting more frantic with every second. The prosecution used the tape of Nyla's confession from the night of her arrest, in which she admitted to striking Ari in a fit of wrath following his threatening to tell Levon everything. I didn't mean to kill him. Nyla's voice quivered on the tape. I wanted him to stop only. He persisted in saying Levon would never pardon me, and he was going to ruin my life. I simply found it intolerable at last. Still, the damage had been done. Ari's decisions led to his death. Regret would not be able to bring him back. Nyla's mental state formed the last weapon the defense used to try to influence the jury. They contacted a psychologist who claimed Nyla had been experiencing extreme emotional pain, most likely exacerbated by the weight of her double life and the guilt she carried following news of Ari's blood relations to Levon. The prosecution responded with their own expert, who maintained that Nyla's emotional state was precarious, but did not absolve her of guilt. She had made deliberate decisions, each one bringing her life closer to the fatal blow. Nyla stood up as the trial almost came to end. Her evidence was emotional and unvarnished. She told the jury everything, the affair, the lies, the murder. But she begged them to realize she had never meant things to go so far. Nyla said, her voice cracking. I was broken. I knew I turned on Levon. I am aware I destroyed all we created. Still, I never wanted to kill Ari. I simply wanted him to stop, to leave me alone, so enabling me to return to my life. The jury's ruling would ultimately rely on one question. Was this a cold-blooded murder, or an impassioned act motivated by intense guilt and fear? The courtroom grew tense as the jury left to deliberate. Nyla avoided looking at Levon, sitting silently with hands shaking in her lap. Her spirit had been broken by the weight of the last few days. The reality of what lay ahead seemed intolerable. She had admitted, but the issue of whether the jury would view her crime as murder or manslaughter still loomed large like a storm cloud, just waiting to blow. The jury worked for 3 long days. Reporters speculated about the result inside the courtroom, satisfying the public's ravenous taste for every dramatic element of the case. Outside, some to object what they thought to be an open and shut case of a cold-blooded killer gathered, while others, more sympathetic, said Nyla had suffered enough. The public was split, and the media had presented her as everything from a sad victim of circumstance to a vicious femme fatale. Levon withdrew inward at the same time. Although he had given his piece during the trial, the truth was that his feelings were a jumble. Though he had once loved Nyla, after all, part of him still loved her. But now love was buried beneath layers of resentment, treachery, and great loss. Ari's death had ripped a hole through his family, and no judgment could close that void. Nothing would undo the harm done, even with Nyla sentenced. The courtroom was charged with suspense when the jury at last came back. As the foreman stood to render his decision, everyone gasped. Nyla closed her eyes, her heart thumping so loudly she could hardly hear the words spoken. Guilt of second-degree murder, the foreman said. The room gasped collectively, and for a moment, time appeared to stop as the words flowed over Nyla's mind, went blank. She had been convicted of a crime of passion, rather than of premeditated murder. The prosecution's account of a deliberate, cold-blooded woman had been turned down, but so had the defense's picture of her as a totally shattered victim. The jury had decided on a middle ground. She had acted out of desperation and wrath, but they also felt she owned full responsibility for her behavior. The judge, an austere woman with years of experience, decided on a Monday for the sentence. Nyla spent that period in her cell waiting for what seemed to be the end of her life. Her guilt weighed intolerable, and the trial had sapped her. She kept playing back Aries' death in her mind over and over, each time trying to understand how she had let everything fall so horribly. Nyla went one last time into the courtroom on the day of sentence. The judge had looked over all the facts, including side-of-view character testimony. Speaking of Nyla's past kindness and generosity, her sister Lale had begged for forgiveness and discussed her mental fragility in the months before the crime. Ari's family, on the other hand, had demanded justice for the young man whose life had been cruelly cut short, speaking with a mix of grief and rage. Ultimately, the judge rendered a strong ruling. Nyla, even if I respect your emotional suffering and the complexity of your circumstances, your behavior killed a young man. You took a life regardless of the situation. That cannot be undone. You have expressed regret, but the law demands responsibility. As the judge sentenced, the room remained quiet. I now sentence you to 20 years in prison, with parole possibility after 15. The sentence knocked Nyla like a physical blow. 20 years from now, her freedom gone. Her life as she had known it over would be spent behind bars, the rest of her youth lost. She simply silently accepted her fate. There was no outburst or protest. Sitting in the audience, Levon felt no delight in the result. The weight of the circumstances left him empty, even as justice was done. The fallout from the trial permeated every life of every person engaged. Levon sought divorce soon after Nyla's sentence. Their marriage quietly came apart, already damaged beyond repair. Levon left the town behind the memories of his once perfect life. Work gave him comfort. He buried himself in his position as a digital archivist, even though the trauma of what had happened never totally left him. Distressed by his death, Aries' family battled to understand the catastrophe. They recalled him as a young man, bursting with life, passion, and potential, whose dreams had been extinguished far too quickly. Once revered in small circles, his photography work attracted posthumous interest. Yet, his affair with Nyla loomed over his legacy. Nyla spent her incarceration in contemplation and grief. She turned inward, reading and writing much of her time in search of some kind of solace among her punishment. She cut relations with everyone else, choosing solitude over the agonizing reminders of her past, although she kept sporadic contact with her sister Lala. Though the years seemed to run ahead of her like an unending horizon, she held a faint hope that one day, maybe, she would be forgiven. Not by others, but by herself. The scandal lost public awareness as time went on and other tragedies, other narratives took front stage. For those who had personally experienced it, though, the memory of Nyla's affair, Ari's murder, and the shattered lives it left behind would never really fade. Their hearts would still be marked by the complex web of love, treachery, and death, a constant reminder of how readily the most normal life might deviate into anarchy. And for Nyla, the woman who had yearned for passion and freedom, the bars of her prison became both her penance and her sentence, a continual reminder of the decisions that had brought her to this place. Years went by, and the globe carried on as it always does. Nyla spent her time in jail. The once vibrant woman now exhibited quiet resignation. Once a passionate and turbulent life, hers had evolved into a daily grind behind bars. She had aged, the lines on her face bearing the weight of her choices. 15 years into her term, Nyla was granted good behavior parole. She left jail a free woman, but freedom lost the appeal it used to have. She had changed. The outside world had changed. Her vivid past had faded into subdued tones, and the life she had always dreamed of seemed far away, as though it belonged to someone else. Levon had long since remarried and created a new life, far from the shadow of the tragedy. He had never reached out to Nyla in jail. He had closed that chapter of his life behind. The divorce had been the last cutting off of their relationship. For him, only a quiet acceptance of the road he had chosen, not a trip back in time. Too, Aries' family had progressed in their own unique manner. Every day they grieved for him, but knowing that justice, in all its imperfect form, had been done, brought them peace. Now appreciated for its genius, his photography lived on as evidence of his talent and premature death. Regarding Nyla, she withdrew to herself. She lived quietly, far from public view, without family left to turn to, or a will to rekindle old relationships. Though she knew she could never go back, she spent her days considering her decisions and seeking atonement. Though she carried it with a quiet dignity and accepted it as part of who she had become, the guilt was her continual companion. Nyla was ultimately no more the woman driven by forbidden love and desperation. She had changed. She was a survivor of her own decisions, always touched by the catastrophe she had started. Now, devoid of its former illusions, her life was one of quiet penance. And so, the narrative of Nyla, Levon, and Ari faded into the annals of lost lives. A warning story of love gone wrong, of secrets too heavy to bear, of the terrible results that follow when desire and guilt collide.